stories and images that made news during the year. So much of news is about change, but some important things and people endure. And no one was more enduring than our own Mrs. Thatcher. In January, after almost 9 years in office, she became this century's longest-serving Prime Minister. Red noses abounded in February, and nothing to do with the weather. Comic Relief raised almost £7 million for famine victims. March was dominated by death amid huge controversy. In Gibraltar, 3 IRA terrorists were shot dead by British security forces. At the funeral in Belfast a week later, 3 people were killed in a gun and grenade attack. 5 days after that, 2 British Army corporals who stumbled on another funeral were dragged from their car and murdered. In April, John Demjanjuk, a modern Ivan the Terrible, was sentenced to death for the murder of thousands of Jews during the war. Uproar followed. May, and the first of the West's important presidential elections. France's President Mitterrand was returned to power, keeping socialism alive at the Élysée Palace. On June the 11th, the world's rock stars gathered at Wembley to sing a collective happy birthday to Nelson Mandela, 70 years old and still under lock and key. The IRA's summer of violence, begun with attacks on British servicemen in Europe, continued. 6 soldiers died when their van was blown up at Lisbon. July saw the first of the year's major disasters. The oil rig Piper Alpha exploded, killing 167 men. It was the North Sea's worst accident. There was further tragedy in the Gulf. The US warship Vincennes destroyed a civilian Iranian aircraft by mistake. Nearly 300 passengers were killed. In August, the IRA smuggled a bomb into the Mill Hill barracks in North London. 1 soldier was killed. Later that month, 8 more died when their bus was blown up near Ballygawley in County Tyrone. And Pakistan's General Zia died when his plane blew up in midair. Natural disaster followed in the Sudan. Torrential flooding left thousands homeless, adding to that country's already massive problems. For the Americans, there were happier occasions. The space shuttle Discovery was successfully launched in September, putting the US space program back on course. But to the south, Hurricane Gilbert blew its worst, wrecking large parts of the Caribbean and threatening Texas. For the Canadians, disgrace at the Olympics. National hero Ben Johnson was stripped of his gold medal and sent home after failing a drugs test. October, and the new spirit of East-West cooperation sprang into action. 2 grey whales trapped in the Arctic ice were freed after an extraordinary international rescue operation. November, and Mrs. Thatcher showed solidarity with Lech Wałęsa as the Lenin shipyard was closed by the Polish government. And the other leader of the Western world was chosen. George Bush beat Michael Dukakis to the US presidency as the people opted for continuity and no new taxes. December saw a political casualty in Britain. Edwina Currie, having voiced her forthright opinions once too often, departed with egg on her face. But the year's end has been dominated by further tragedy. At Clapham in South London, 2 rush-hour trains collided, killing 34 people. And over Lockerbie in Dumfriesshire, Britain's worst air disaster. Pan Am Flight 103 crashed with 258 people on board. A bomb had been planted on the aircraft. President Gorbachev's year, despite enormous progress in international relations and an often rapturous foreign press, ended as it began, with the Soviet leader facing tough opposition to his domestic reform program from the Kremlin old guard. That opposition was lambasted today in an open letter to Mr. Gorbachev from a group of prominent supporters. In it, they said Mr. Gorbachev's reforms are bogged down by a dictatorship of mediocrity rampant at the highest levels of the Communist Party. They called for mass resignations. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent David Smith examines Mr. Gorbachev's year of success and turmoil.
Mikhail Gorbachev began 1988 in confident mood. In foreign affairs, he'd just clinched the INF deal with the United States. His policies of glasnost and perestroika at home were gaining him credit in the West and giving inspiration to millions of his own people. Relations with the United States, always an indicator of the Soviet mood, were at the beginning of the year extremely cordial. The two leaders followed the success of the INF deal, the first to abolish an entire class of nuclear weapons, by exchanging New Year messages. And Mr. Gorbachev would not allow the Americans any monopoly on expressions of goodwill.
Let me assure you that Soviet people, too, have an equally great stock of goodwill. Putting it to full use is the most noble and responsible task of government and political leaders in our two countries.
Let us consecrate this year to showing not courage for war, but courage for peace. We owe this to mankind. We owe it to our children and their children and generations to come.
In May, the friendship blossomed in spectacular style when the Reagans made their historic visit to Moscow. The two men got along famously. President Reagan said to the Gorbachev, "We think of you as friends." Even the ladies appeared to bury their much-discussed rivalry. And Mr. Gorbachev kept up the diplomatic and public relations offensive all the way. At a press conference at the end of the summit, he professed disappointment at the lack of concrete progress, and he blamed the United States.
So I think we could have achieved more during this meeting.
But here, to a large extent, was what the summit had been all about. The picture opportunity, perhaps, of the decade, and the lasting impression of those days in Moscow. Reagan and Gorbachev, two leaders whose formidable arsenals of destruction were ranged against each other, now walking together in Red Square, the very heart of what Reagan had called the evil empire.
Mr. Gorbachev obviously deserves an enormous amount of credit for getting out of that rut that the Soviet Union had got into over all those years with Brezhnev in office, and particularly with Mr. Gromyko as foreign minister. On the other hand, it did need somebody to respond. As President Reagan once said, it takes two to tango, and he proved to be willing to tango with Mr. Gorbachev.
Mr. Gorbachev's masterstroke was a pledge to put an end to the occupation of Afghanistan, the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In February, he said that more than 100,000 troops who first began their ill-fated adventure 9 years ago would begin to leave by May the 15th. They did. By August, half had gone. Although guerrilla attacks later slowed the withdrawal, one of the major stumbling blocks to good relations with the West was being dismantled. Then, in the turmoil of Middle East politics, Mr. Gorbachev was equally bold. He urged the PLO chairman, Yasser Arafat, to take decisive steps towards peace. The Israelis are still not ready to respond, but Mr. Gorbachev is taking credit for making Arafat play the card of openly recognizing Israel. Throughout 1988, Mikhail Gorbachev positively relished being seen on the world stage. Closer to home, though, the Gorbachev story was a little different. Relations with Eastern Europe were mixed. Yugoslavia, once the renegade of the communist bloc, was welcomed back into the fold. But its right to a separate kind of socialism was also recognized. Hardline countries like Romania were given sharp warnings about the slow or non-existent pace of their reforms. Poland seemed better. Mr. Gorbachev was given a warm welcome there. He expressed the hope that perestroika would work in Poland. On that, the jury is still out. All the time, though, much more daunting challenges remained at home. Some still seriously threatened the Soviet leader's survival and the fate of perestroika itself. With a firm, some would say authoritarian hand, Mr. Gorbachev took on his opponents. The more conservative Politburo members, like his deputy Ligachev, were demoted. Even the seemingly eternal Andrei Gromyko was sent into retirement, as Mr. Gorbachev launched what he called the process of democratization.
I think that the most dangerous thing that he's done has been to try to shift the center of gravity of power within the Soviet political system. All power to the Soviets is the slogan of 1917. It's actually a rather dangerous slogan to to resurrect in the middle of 1988, which is what he did at the party conference. Because throughout those 70 years in between, it's been the power of the party that has really counted. Now, he doesn't want to do away with that power of the party, but he knows that the party has to relinquish some of its authority in order to govern effectively and efficiently.
This year, Mr. Gorbachev has faced nothing more potentially explosive than unrest in the furthest reaches of the Soviet Empire. In Armenia, ethnic uprisings have cost lives, and a bitter nationality dispute still simmers on ominously. It appears to be no nearer a solution. In various ways, the Baltic states showed little sign of relenting on their call for a greater say in the running of their own affairs. What they've done in the last 6 months is nothing short of the most direct challenge to the Politburo itself. It's a huge problem for Mr. Gorbachev, not least because the Baltic states are using the very themes the Soviet leader champions to assert their right to independence. As importantly, on the economic front, Mr. Gorbachev has made few breakthroughs. He preaches the theory of free market forces, he demands greater production, and he calls for more discipline. It's designed not to make the Soviet Union a totally capitalist economy, but to make it one that works. To his own people, that's a long way off. They hear a lot about change. They see little of it.
I think if you were to ask the ordinary Ivan Ivanich in the street in the Soviet Union, you would get a very disappointing, sceptical response indeed. Before Gorbachev, goods and services were very scarce, poor quality, but if you could get them, they were very cheap. Now, they're even scarcer, even worse quality, and they're dear, and likely to get dearer. So for the mass of people, much of the enthusiasm that we have for Mr. Gorbachev is not there. However, so far as the intelligentsia are concerned, then they have been hugely inspired, and they have always played an important role in Russian and Soviet society.
By far the most persistent problem has been the age-old one of food shortages. Mr. Gorbachev has said Soviet farmers should be masters of their own land, but agricultural reforms have been slow to filter through the cumbersome Soviet system. And these people in Siberia were quick to complain to their leader that there's nothing to buy in their shops. Hardly surprising then that this month Mr. Gorbachev tried to put his domestic problems behind him and make another high-profile visit abroad. He chose New York, that most American of cities, and New Yorkers responded with interest, warmth and affection. And that was only in the streets. The drama heightened at the United Nations. The Soviet leader made a brilliant speech. Seizing the moment between American administrations, he returned to arms control, this time proposing unilateral cuts in Soviet conventional forces in Eastern Europe.
Today I can report to you that the Soviet Union has taken a decision to reduce its armed forces.
Once again, it seemed, the Soviet leader had claimed the starring role. Tragically, though, an earthquake in Armenia was to cut all that short. Mr. Gorbachev cancelled visits to Cuba and Britain. He returned home to deal with one of his country's worst natural disasters. He must have been bitterly disappointed that the tragedy did not act as a healer in the ethnic dispute. Rather, it seemed to make it worse. The end of the year must have convinced the Soviet leader that however well he does on the world stage, his most crucial tests remain at home. For Mikhail Gorbachev, then, a year in which achievements were often overshadowed by setbacks. A year which raised doubts, not about his commitment, but to what extent he can and will succeed.
David Smith. Tonight's headlines: Yugoslavia has been plunged into a new crisis with the resignation of its Prime Minister and the whole cabinet. It follows Parliament's refusal to approve a series of measures to tackle severe economic difficulties. From everyone here at Channel 4 News, have a happy and peaceful New Year.